Welcome, everyone. I'm today joined by Dr. James Orr. It's a distinguished honor to have you, James. Very good to be speaking with you today on Heidegger and wherever else it's going to lead us. James Orr is Assistant Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the Faculty of Divinity at Cambridge. And James and I met last year when we were both part of a group that went to Westminster Abbey with Jordan Peterson. And we've since spoken a couple of times. We've also had the pleasure to bring John Raveki to Cambridge, thanks to James's position there. And today I'd like to, cover a few things in regards to Heidegger and your work on him. But maybe we just begin with a very open question, which is, how did you find your way to reading Heidegger, and what was your interest, maybe many years ago now, but still, in death and infinitude and temporality, in his understanding of truth in regards also to Aquinas? So maybe just introduce us to your work and your interest.
Well, thank you so much, Johannes. It's great to be with you, and wonderful to see the way in which you're bringing these deep and difficult and but fascinating philosophical ideas to the general public. It's just terrific to be part of your platform. Thank you for inviting me. The immediate answer to the question, I suppose, is that is a rather mundane one. I came up to Cambridge to study for a diploma in theology and religious studies in 2009. And as part of, I was in corporate finance law before, so this was quite a leap. And one of the papers that I chose was the kind of flagship third year paper. It doesn't exist anymore, but it's a flagship third year paper in the undergraduate syllabus called simply Metaphysics. It's a very sort of pregnant Heideggerian title, Metaphysics. And the paper was structured in a fascinating way. It was run at the time by Professor Sarah Coakley, who's a distinguished theologian, but somebody who also is fascinated by philosophical questions, and particularly philosophical objections to religious commitment, and particularly, broadly speaking, Christian commitment and Abrahamic monotheistic commitment. And so the way she structured the paper was really, and I think she inherited this from her predecessor, was was trying to think of the kind of, to understand the skeptical posture of modernity towards questions involving not just religion, but the transcendent as such. And she began it from Kant and Kant's First Critique and the great assault on the traditional arguments in natural theology in the great second half of the First Critique, the transcendental dialectic. And so we worked a lot on that and thinking about transcendental idealism. And I must say, I was underwhelmed by Kant's objections to religious belief. I just think that they don't work, or at least, let's say, they're far too heavily invested in transcendental idealism being true. And because I don't think there are many good reasons to suppose that transcendental idealism is true, I don't think that any arguments that take it as true to be that convincing. So I don't think there's anything that really religious believers have much to worry about from the First Critique. I think Hume's arguments in the dialogues concerning natural religion are much more solvent and powerful. But anyway, this was the narrative of the paper, and the second installment in that great narrative was Heidegger. And in Heidegger's being in time and the, that kind of the hinterlands to being in time in particular, the way in which Heidegger emerges from first a kind of effectively Catholic seminary and a deep immersion in medieval philosophy, obviously saturated, soaked through with deep theological presumptions. At the time, he thought he was doing his that the research on Duns Scotus, it turned out to be Thomas of Erfurt. Yeah. But so that hinterland, the Catholic one, and the shift towards a kind of Lutheranism in the late 1910s starts doing these very interesting lectures that are now published as a phenomenology of religious life on Augustine and Plotinus and Paul. He's fascinated by 1 Thessalonians and the sort of raw immediacy of that kind of the eschatological posture of the early Christians, which he commended, and which was very important, I think, later in the way he develops this sort of notion, attitudes and his conception of time as it's theorized in Being in Time. I actually thought that there was something much deeper and more interesting going on as a critique of at least some strands within the theology of his day. And I was struck too by the way in which that period, roughly speaking, 1900 onwards, really from in the wake of Husserl's logical investigations right at the beginning of the 20th century, I was struck by the way in which so many of Husserl's early followers were mesmerized in one way or another by questions involving religion. You saw a staggering number of conversions, sometimes away from religion, but also towards Catholicism, from Protestantism to Catholicism and the other direction, and from unbelief and agnosticism to really a real kind of theological investment in philosophy. And I found this fascinating because Husserl himself has actually remarkably little to say about religious questions. As far as we know, he's a Jewish-born philosopher who was quietly converted to Protestantism, but was notoriously or commendably, depending on which way you see it, resistant to saying a great deal about God. This is something that he really was just sort of out of bounds in many ways, sort of methodologically out of bounds and out of bounds in other ways as well. So I found that backdrop to Heidegger fascinating, and then the emerging the great assault on metaphysics that we find in Being in Time and in subsequent works. And of course, it changes over the course of his career, and entire careers have been devoted to plotting and tracing those changes and arguing over whether or not how they were to be understood. But that's how I came to Heidegger. It was really through a fantastic paper, a sort of an undergraduate paper, which got me excited about Heidegger, and I started reading. And the more I read of him, the more I realized that you can't really understand European philosophy in the 20th century without grappling with Being in Time. What I realized early on was that the kind of pop philosophy take that I had grown up with, that there's analytic Anglophone philosophy, and then on the continent you've got Sartre, and you've got Camus, and you've got these sort of the French existentialists on the rive gauche, and they're smoking their gitane and wearing their berets and so on. What I realized is that actually all of them, when you really read them, you realize that they are often just rehearsing kind of hand-me-down Heidegger.
Yeah.
That is to say, but a lot of it is just there are some moments in Sartre which I think are quite penetrating and interesting, but broadly speaking, all of it is downstream. None of it would be possible without Being in Time and without the kind of that sort of seismic moment in the history of modern philosophy. And so as I came to appreciate his importance as a kind of fons et origo, a kind of foundational moment in European philosophy, I thought, well, if I'm going to do any continental philosophy at all, and there's a lot of brilliant continental philosophy going on here in Cambridge, and if I want to understand Francophone philosophy, I've got to understand what's going on in Heidegger.
Do you think that that's also... I came to Heidegger through my early, knowledge is probably saying too much. I went to a humanistisches Gymnasium, so I had to, I was lucky enough to study Latin and ancient Greek from an early age. And when I went to Italy to study PPE, basically Economia e Scienze Sociali, I had a professor there who Well, I think within 10 seconds or so, the word logos was written on the whiteboard in ancient Greek, of course, and it all came back. He never mentioned the name Heidegger. He had done his PhD with Friedrich Wilhelm von Hermann, who's Heidegger's private secretary, and then also he was given a special chair, Lehrstuhl at Freiburg. So Ivo de Gennaro was his name. He never mentioned Heidegger, but the way of thinking to me was extremely close to the Greek way of thinking that I was familiar with, reading Plato and Aristotle and the pre-Socratics in the original Greek, and this nearness to, or what you call the raw immediacy. I would say the raw immediacy of phenomena. And what to me is so striking in Being in Time is, and on the first page, he quotes importantly from the Sophists, but then also says, which ties in perhaps with more what you were saying, he says in the first paragraph that there's eine neu zu entfachende, so a newly to be developed gigantomachia peritis ouseas. So a gigantic battle for the meaning of being, we could perhaps translate. So with Heidegger, maybe even theatrically or so, but there's always something seems to be at stake in what it means to be. And he brings it all together. And for you, especially, I think also in terms of a Christian way of seeing the world, and especially in a time of intense crisis. Husserl and another teacher of Heidegger's, Paul Natorp in Marburg, who said that we are, the tower has fallen. We are wading through a field of ruins. So it's this early, I think, 20th century mood of destruction and utter crisis that they are in. And Heidegger seems to be wanting, just like Husserl, to find a way back to the phenomena, and also to try and find, well, a new way of accessing the world, that is, again, without, to come back to this paper you had there, without the metaphysical baggage so much. Is this maybe also what drew you in, or would it be something else, and what kept you going, perhaps, reading Heidegger?
Yes, I mean, I think what I appreciated about Heidegger is that it wasn't the sort of standard kind of pop atheist critique of religious commitment that was so common. It feels like an age ago, but really in 2005, 6, 7, when I was just before I was starting to read Heidegger, of course, there was all of these, just this entire cottage industry of new atheist literature, which was just so heartbreakingly, risibly awful in terms of its philosophical sophistication, that I felt sorry for. I felt that the great atheistic traditions in European philosophy were being just besmirched by standing in continuity with these figures, and so, I mean, reading Heidegger just came as a relief, really, because I just thought that there are great challenges to the rationality of religious commitment and to the religious life and the coherence of the religious life and so on, but they were not coming from people like Richard Dawkins and A.C. Grayling and Sam Harris and so on and so forth. But then even compared to somebody like Nietzsche or Hume,
yeah,
what I found so fascinating about Heidegger is that it was, I think, is what Heine talks as, the way Heine describes Kant as the kind of the all destroyer. I think that was the right link there. But I think, Heidegger has a kind of comprehensive critique, not just of arguments for the existence of God, but for the entire project of Western metaphysics. And so there was a kind of awe-inspiring breadth to that critique, and an extraordinary kind of boldness and sort of temerity that he wanted to take on logocentric metaphysics from Plato up to him. And I think, whatever one makes of Heidegger, there is just something remarkable about him in that sense. He is epochal in the way that I think Hegel is, the way that Kant is, the way even that maybe Socrates is, that, whether he's right or wrong, he sees himself at a threshold in the history of philosophy. If he's right, everyone since Plato up to him, 2.5 millennia of Western philosophy is wrong. And so there was something thrilling about that claim and that boldness, and the sophistication with which he treats the targets of his objections. I mean, thinking the way he grapples with Descartes in the famous Destruction in the opening section of Being and Time, but also the way in which he's not. His criticisms are not entirely dismissive, but they don't dismiss an entire body of thought. So if you think of the way in which how important Aristotle is for him in coming to raise the question of fundamental ontology and breaking out kind of Husserl's framing in formal ontology, or the way in which he draws on Plato. He's broadly very critical of Plato. He sees Plato as really beginning all this the history of the forgetfulness of being, the Seinsvergessenheit, and so on. But he also has some very interesting things to say about Plato and Plato's doctrine of truth. And of course, he thinks all the problems do begin there. So yes, I think it's the broader sweep of the critique of metaphysics as such that kind of intoxicated me. And then theological commitment as one sort of example of one chapter in the history of the forgetting of the meaning of being. And that struck me as important, because I think one of the problems with the more naive expressions of atheism was that they just didn't see themselves as being situated particularly within a philosophical tradition. They just took it for granted that metaphysical naturalism, the claim that all truths are scientific truths or reducible to scientific truths, was just a given, and there was nothing more to be asked about whether or not there are moral truths, or whether consciousness is real, or whether there are aesthetic truths or values, and so on. And that sort of crude reductionism is something that Plato would himself see as being complicit in the history of the forgetfulness of being. So yes, that's what I found so exhilarating about him.
Yes, very much so. I think there are quotes from Heidegger, and of course they're not coming to me at the moment, where he says none of what I say is atheism. Where he says that the atheist needs the theos the most. What Heidegger's project is, you mentioned destruction, which as far as I remember, should have been part of the second part of Being in Time, or the third one, but which of course was never written. But I think there are moments of destruction or destruction in also the part that has been published, which is now Being in Time. For example, as you mentioned, on Descartes, but also in terms of truth. And maybe we can talk about truth now in a second. But I think what Heidegger tries to show is, on some level, you could say that everything is wrong up until me, but maybe on a more substantial level, is that there has been a buildup, and the forgetting is, as it were, inbuilt in the structure of being itself, insofar as truth qua aletheia is always both concealment and unconcealment. You cannot get rid from unconcealment won't lead to a disappearance of that which is concealed or remains concealed, or there's a necessary concealment in any disclosure, etc. So this buildup of what he comes to call or refer to as metaphysics, which to him I think at some point is equivalent to even the forgetting of being, and that's maybe for another time to discuss further why he says that. But in some important sense, it's not to say I think Plato is wrong and I get it right, but the buildup of what has become metaphysics is through the millennia leading to exactly the kind of crisis we're now in. And so the attempt of destruction is to destroy, but not like the futurism movement in Italy, for example, just destroy everything and all the past must be gone, but to deliver over from the past, that which has been, or the having been, etc., into our time and our future, what is, I would say, worthy or necessary to be salvaged. And in some sense, his work on truth, and I think you've got some very important things to say about his understanding or maybe misunderstanding of Aquinas, points in this direction, where he says that the traditional conception of truth as correspondence truth is not wrong, but based on the more original, as he says, understanding or conception of truth, which is aletheia, as disclosedness or disclosure. So maybe if you could fill us in on your critique of Heidegger here also, and what the traditional understanding of truth is, and maybe where Heidegger goes a bit astray from Aquinas.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I mean, it's worth pointing out that, you know, the critique, it's good to get the ambiguity in that word destruction, which you attention to. It's not just a kind of nihilistic project, but one that's that doesn't want to construct a replacement either. It thinks that it's important to leave metaphysics, as it were, to some extent in the rubble. And he, although he does see himself as the final moment in that unraveling of the metaphysics as a project, he does think that Nietzsche represents in some way the final, you know, its final entombment, as it were. And he's quite clear about this in his lectures on Nietzsche in the late 1930s. That you know, Nietzsche, I think he actually says, you know, Nietzsche marks the end of metaphysics. And it's this point. It's at this point we've got to move on to the completely different question of the truth of being. What do we understand by being, and so on. And so he starts using the language of overcoming, isn't it? Is it Überwindung? I can't remember that, but a sense of overcoming those sort of standard questions. But I think he would then describe certain moves that he insists on methodologically as an exercise in metaphysics. So, for, you know, the famous ontological difference, that is to say, the difference between beings, ontic entities, and being with a capital B, sort of big being, that I think he would be happy to say is a kind of it's not a physical distinction at any rate. So I think but he's wary of bringing in language or bringing in ideas involving transcendence or the supersensible and so on and so forth, for reasons that are not actually that dissimilar from Kant's. And the sequel, if ever there was one, to Being in Time would be Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics in 1929, in which he has quite a lot of sympathetic things to say about, you know, what Kant's recognition that metaphysics is always getting itself into a tangle, because reason is always, as Kant says in the famous opening paragraphs of the First Critique, is always kind of overreaching itself. It's always, you know, speculating and getting detached from what is given to it in the phenomena. So yes, I mean, my interest, one of my interests in Heidegger was the way in which he engages theological sources from early on in a very sophisticated way, in a way that, generally speaking, he's really grasps what it is that theologians are trying to do, and some of the kind of pathologies that affect certain theological projects, and certainly certain theological projects ongoing in the 1920s. So, you know, I think there's a lot that we don't understand about Heidegger's project in Being in Time and his stance towards theology, if we don't recognize, for example, the importance of Rudolf Bultmann for his thought. I think he and Bultmann used to meet for a period almost every week to read John's Gospel. They used to just, you know, study the Gospel of St. John together. And Bultmann, and before him Adolf von Harnack, are well known for criticizing a certain, what they think to be a sort of a dominant theological paradigm, according to which the Hebraic, the kind of raw Hebraic framing of the world, picture of the world, is kind of polluted by this Hellenizing intrusion through Greek philosophy and particularly Greek metaphysics. And one of the things he seems to like a lot about Paul in 1 Thessalonians is that, here's a snapshot of religious believers who are not yet, as it were, caught up in the kind of philosophical theorizing that he thinks always ends badly and always leads into kind of confused picturing of the world. So I was quite struck when I found these lectures that he gave in 1926. So just as he's beginning the drafting of Being in Time, in that about a year before, it was the academic year before that extraordinary summer where he effectively writes Being in Time almost from start to finish, or at least the final draft almost in these enormous chunks. Because what I found in his reading of Aquinas was actually a relatively unsophisticated reading of what Aquinas is, what Aquinas understands by not just truth but finitude and time and God, which in many ways incorporates a lot of the kind of errors of the more kind of naive theologians or natural exercises as natural theology that he and others are very good at criticizing. So, for example, he often seems to think that Aquinas is committed to some kind of correspondence theory of truth, which is, of course, what he's at such pains to criticize in Being in Time. And it's very hard to read Aquinas's great treatise De Veritate, his questions on truth, or the relevant bits of the Summa Theologiae, or the relevant bits of the Summa Contra Gentiles, and to come away with this idea that, at least at some kind of fundamental level, any theist could think that what truth is simply some kind of correspondence relation between a proposition and some fact or state of affairs or object in the world. If you are an Abrahamic monotheist, you are just committed to the doctrine of creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo. And what that means is that all truths that are truths are known by God and are true in virtue of God's holding them to be true, or maybe making them true. Doesn't have to be productive making. It could simply be maybe grounding in some way. But Aquinas just thinks, this is a classic example of what he later calls ontotheology, or the ontotheological constitution of metaphysics, as he says in his famous lecture on this, I think in 1954 or so, 54, 50, I think around about 54. And so what he thinks is happening, and this is not just true of theology, but of metaphysics as such, is that the metaphysician takes some notion, a logos, some account of the world, or some deep, ultimately explanatory principle for the world, and particularly for the being of the world, and then projects that up onto this kind of grand metaphysical canvas, and then divinizes it in some way, or gives it some kind of ultimacy. So it might be the clear and distinct ideas for Descartes, or it might be Geist for Hegel, or in the case of Aquinas, God. And he thinks that all of these are part of this, are making the same kind of error. And actually, in that lecture, the much later lecture in the 1950s, there's a very moving passage where he talks about really addressing theologians, saying the trouble with theologians is that they're just grounding ontic entities in some kind of supreme being. So this is the kind of the double error that he says of grounding beings in being and being in the supreme being. And so he says that this is the trouble with this, is that this is, back to Pascal, this is the God of the philosophers. It's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then, so the famous passage is this God, the God of ontotheology, he says, is the appropriate name for the God of philosophy. But man cannot pray to this God, nor offer sacrifices to him. Man cannot fall to his knees in awe before the causa sui, this grand sort of onto-theological projection of metaphysics, nor dance and play music before this God. And then he says, perhaps this godless thinking, my godless thinking, is closer to the divine God than onto-theology would like to admit. And it's an incredibly powerful passage. He's effectively saying that, my critique of metaphysics is in a way, and as it were, theology's complicity in the history of metaphysics and the forgetfulness of the meaning of being, is in fact doing a service to theology, because it's attuning theologians to the life, the mode of existence that religious believers in fact experience and live. The life of prayer, of genuflection, of dancing. Mm-hmm. There's not much genuflection or dancing in typical Anglican services on a Sunday morning. But you go to the right churches, some of these wonderful African Pentecostal churches. I mean, you really can see this. You walk in there and you think, this is not Pascal's God of the philosophers. They're not worrying about the cosmological argument in this place. And so I think there's something quite sort of moving about that. But as I said, I think there are genuine mistakes, misunderstandings of what Aquinas is doing. And in fact, there's a famous misreading of Heidegger here by the great French continental philosopher Jean-Luc Marion. And so Jean-Luc Marion says in Dieu hors texte, his great book of God Without Being in 1980, says, Heidegger's right to indict Aquinas on the charge of onto-theology. But then he retracts this after some criticisms from the Dominicans in the 1980s, and actually says, no, on a careful reading, it's not true to say that Aquinas thinks of God as some kind of factory of beings, right? This very sort of this idea of a kind of productive, efficient causation. But that's to misunderstand what the doctrine of creation as Aquinas articulates it, the metaphysics of creation as Aquinas articulates is all about.
Maybe can you say more on that, and then also on, because this is such a crucial chapter in Being a Time. If anyone wants to read along, we're talking about paragraph or chapter 44, Dasein, Erschlossenheit und Wahrheit. That's Dasein, disclosedness, and truth. And when we look at 44a, he talks about the traditional concept of truth and its ontological foundations, where he says that Thomas of Aquinas speaks of truth as adequatio intellectus et re, which he takes to be correspondence truth. Maybe we should also say briefly what correspondence truth is, but maybe just begin again on this misconception of God, because this is also what Heidegger sees in metaphysics at work is, and James put it really well, I'll just repeat it for a second. They begin with ontic entities, with beings, and reify, we could say, to a general beingness of beings. And in terms of Aquinas, this is God. So beings are ens creatum, created entities, and God is the summum ens. And so it's almost that Heidegger himself has a bit of a representational way of thinking here, and he sees this at work everywhere throughout, and he actually sees it at work also in technology. So he thinks that technics is a result of a sort of a collapsed metaphysics, etc., that also just uses beings or operates with beings in terms of a generalized beingness, maybe as data or information, etc. I think we can learn a lot from it, but I think it's also important that we see where perhaps Heidegger himself is misled by his own way of looking back over this history, where there is a certain richness that his of Aquinas, for example, that his reading doesn't really grasp. It's too simple almost.
Yes, and it's surprising because he's such a generally such a sophisticated reader of the philosophical inheritance. I mean, often very hasty and can be quite quick in his conclusions and his assessments. But he is somebody who is steeped in the medieval universe and did understand. Had read a very great deal of the most important texts from that period. I mean, you're right. He's got a lot to teach us in terms of certainly, one of the busiest areas of Heidegger research at the moment, I think, or the way in which Heidegger, at least applied Heidegger, as it were, Heidegger is being used and deployed in the humanities at the moment, is on ecological questions. And the way in which he, and this is mainly later in his career, the way in which he redeploys the critique of metaphysics as thinking of being as a sort of standing reserve to ecological ends. So the critique of technology, obviously, is that if we are so attuned to thinking about being as such, as sort of just standing reserve, as manipulable, as capital, if you like, as stuff that can be just used to our ends, then inevitably that's going to have certain ramifications for how we think of our relationship to the world, and we're much more likely to sort of domesticate it and try to control it and use it and so on. And that's part of what he thinks of as the sort of the error of just this kind of the forgetfulness of just the sheer fact of being. One of the things I tried to argue in my work a few years ago on him was that he has a similar view, kind of critique of the way in which time is understood, and so that time he thinks is also understood as a kind of standing reserve. I think he calls it a kind of this sort of nunc stans, a kind of eternity as a sort of standing now, and what I suggest is that he has not just an onto-theological critique of time and temporality, but actually an onto, what I call slightly mischievously, an onto-chronological critique of time. So of the way in which time is understood in the tradition. So just to recap, the onto-theological critique says, what happens is the metaphysician hypostasizes, reifies particular ontic entities and kind of ignores their primordial origin, and then it projects it up onto this big metaphysical cinema screen, and then illicitly construes as ontologically foundational that screen for all beings as such. And so that kind of projectionist critique is just a much more sophisticated version of what we find in the other masters of suspicion. We find it in Feuerbach to some extent, we find it in Nietzsche to some extent, we find it in Freud, we find it in Marx in a slightly different way. And so what I think I spotted was that he has a kind of onto-chronological critique of metaphysics and particularly the way in which Aquinas understands time and temporality. And so the basic idea is that he thinks that there's this sort of illicitly chronometric way of understanding time in terms of simply sort of divisible units. And he thinks that onto-chronological metaphysics, again, my word, not his, reduces time to a kind of unending series of present ontic moments. And then the same move happens as an illicit projection onto what he thinks is a kind of big cinema screen of eternity, the species aeternitatis. And then from that backdrop, you get these sort of divisible moments of the standing reserve of time, and that gets reified, that becomes foundational. But in fact, it's just derivative of it, and they're just caught. You could just caught in this loop. Now, I think that is a very very interesting critique of Aquinas, but it's demonstrably mistaken. And I can't quite believe that Heidegger makes an error like this, but of course, for Aquinas, God is not eternity, and divine eternity is not sempiternity. That is to say, it's not just an unending series of putatively divisible temporal slices. God is atemporal. He's outside time. He's not just that he's been around forever and will be around forever. It's just that there are no kind of temporal predicates that are true of him. But I think a lot of the kind of critique of being in time, at various points, he starts to fumble towards this doctrine of analogy, which is so important for Aquinas. An analogy allows a sort of way through between the sort of this idea that divine eternity, divine time is like creaturely time, just without an end, just, lots and lots and lots and lots, just in infinitely many temporal slices. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, this idea that divine time is totally unlike creaturely time at all, so that there's absolutely nothing that can be said about it or believed about it or known about it and so on. Now, the doctrine of analogy allows for a way to mediate between these two. We're happy with the notion of analogy. We're happy with the notion of saying that diet is healthy and that human being is healthy. And we can understand there that healthy is not being used univocally, but we can also understand that it's not being used equivocally. And so Aquinas says, there's a huge, just shelves and shelves of books on analogy more generally, but also analogy in Aquinas. And I don't think Heidegger really grapples with how powerful that device is to be able to develop in a way that avoids a lot of his criticisms of metaphysics, an understanding of the divine that doesn't sort of naively project onto the big cinema screen, big daddy God, ontic predicates, ontic ideas, projections, but as it were, allows us to say something. It is not completely equivocal, as Wittgenstein says. A nothing will do as well as a something about which nothing can be said. So he's not saying that. It's not complete equivocity in the way that we might say of when we're talking about a river bank and a bank where you get money from. That would be equivocal. There is some kind of analogical bridge between language about creation and predicating it in an analogically irresponsible way of God. But there's just almost nothing, there's no sort of attempt to develop that or engage with that crucial strand in the best of classical theological metaphysics in Heidegger. And so that's what I try to develop. That's what I try to sort of show, that there are some, the sort of quite important and surprising weaknesses in Heidegger's critique of that classical tradition.
In some sense, that was very good. In some sense, though, it could be that, and it's sometimes, when you read Being in Time, there are moments when I've read it, I don't know, way too often at this point. But you realize that, at least, maybe I fancy myself or so, but that, it's written for sometimes quite hastily. And as you said, also, he comes to conclusions very quickly, very often, maybe also because the project just begins to dawn on him. It's so extremely massive, and he doesn't have all that much time, perhaps, left. But I think it's striking also that even if that, say, is very narrow, his understanding there, and perhaps he doesn't go to analogy, and he looks at it almost from äußerlich, almost a superficial way. Äußerlich is not quite superficial, but from outside, instead of going into the thought and trying to explicate. And maybe he also cannot, because he is a phenomenologist. So perhaps that's also one of the issues here. But in some sense, would you agree, because this is where your work is going now, as far as I can see, is that it can still be fruitful? I mean, his attacks on the tradition, insofar as it allows us to read the tradition again, not just to defend it against Herr Heidegger, but to read it in such a way that it becomes meaningful. Because this is ultimately, I think, what he's after, is to try and find ways of engaging with the tradition that it becomes meaningful and not just wearing costumes, but it so that, as to paraphrase Nietzsche, to not just show how hollow the ideals are, but to make them sing again and be meaningful again. Is that something you would agree with? Or
yes, yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's, if you look at the history of philosophical theology in the last 50 years or so, 50, 60 years, I mean, Heidegger is, I would say, certainly within the kind of continental strand of philosophical theology, or that strand of philosophical theology that's attuned to the continental tradition. I mean, that is, I think, how Heidegger is used as a kind of, as a sort of a purifying element, a way of thinking that helps to cleanse us of, cleanse the believer of kind of idolatrous genuflections before the God of the philosophers, which is, this is what Pascal's great cry, to be freed from the God of the philosophers, without a kind of Nietzschean elimination of the divine as such. And I think that, so theologians see that they see that he's not, there's a kind of pregnant agnosticism after that destruction, which I think a lot of philosophically sophisticated believers who are invested in this tradition find very attractive. And then, of course, there are all these moments in Heidegger's later thought, where he starts talking about the gods and the Geführt, the gods and mortal and so on. And of course, that famous utterance in his 1976 Der Spiegel interview that only a God can save us now. What is he talking about there? Lots and lots has been written about that. But there is a sense that I think you see this oddly in I think one of the most Heideggerian philosophers of them all, one of the most Heideggerian Christian philosophers of them all, and that's the film director Terrence Malick. If you watch a movie like film, so I've got the American expression. If you watch a film like The Tree of Life, or if you watch something like The New World in 2005, or even The Thin Red Line, it is just shot through with Heideggerian insights, and the whole cinematography really is Heideggerian in that sense of that kind of dwelling on nature, the fascination with that kind of stillness that you get in Malick. And Malick is probably pretty heterodox, and it's very difficult to know what Malick believes but we know that he wrote this. He translated an important work of Heidegger's in the 1960s. He wanted to do a DPhil at Magdalen College, Oxford, under Gilbert Ryle in the late 60s on the concept of world in Heidegger, Wittgenstein, and Kierkegaard, and they famously fell out. And then he went off to film school in New York, and that was that. But a very important and consequential falling out. So I think that's what's so appealing about him, is that he has a kind of he's brilliant for a kind of theological antiseptic, a theological hygiene, a sort of detoxifying influence on theology's tendency as some people have, as a predecessor, I think I mentioned it earlier, Nicholas Lash is a great philosopher, professor here, described it as going whoring after false gods. And so the idea is the kind of this addiction to a kind of idolatry. And Heidegger is a great antidote to that. And I think there's a recognition of that within the guild of philosophical theologians. And that's why he's got this sort of enduring quality. And it's why actually theologians probably write about him as much as anyone.
That's a very good way of saying it. I mean, especially with an Oxbridge accent, of course, right? What you just said, was it whoring other gods? I'm not going to repeat it.
Whoring after false gods. Yes, that was his expression. I think that's in the beginning and end of religion, but and I'm not sure it was in the Heideggerian sense. Lash was more of a Wittgensteinian, but that's been a common way of trying to. It seems that philosophical theologians are constantly fighting two opponents. One is, village atheists, and the other is sort of, naive theologians who think that God is who like the village atheists think that God is some sort of entity up there, up in the world, and once we get a really, really powerful telescope, we'll sort of see him somehow, or we'll be able to explain those parts, those bits that science can't reach yet, in theological terms, the so-called kind of God of the gaps. And there is certainly that tendency, and Heidegger is a brilliant antidote to both of them.
Yes,
and both his opponents.
And he's an antidote also. So this is the first time hearing this spelled out, this, on the point from someone like you who works in the philosophy of religion. The same is true in philosophy. One of the issues in philosophy, aside from the continental analytic divide, which can also be very fruitful, is that instead of trying to articulate radically new ways of which phenomenology tried to do, radically new ways that are important for us today. Instead, we have new programs. I'm not going to mention any names, but there's new isms that come about, new fashions, new trends that are they're pursued for a couple of decades and then they collapse again. And I think that's also part of the general mode of crisis that we seem to be in, but also so it's a kind of an antiseptic. He can be to that also. And what Nietzsche, though, maybe mistakenly tried to do, or just ended up being, is antithetical. And in so being that anti, you become what you fight. And you mentioned Heidegger's notion of Überwinden. He will later say Verwinden, which is even weirder so it's not going over something, but turning something over from within, almost disarming the dialectics that's at play between the various isms, universalism, particularism, etc., which seem to be going back and forth without giving rise to something genuinely new and fruitful for us. So I very much appreciate everything that you've been saying. And I've learned a lot, so it makes always very good to get clear on my own thoughts. So thank you very much, James. If there's anything you'd like to add, yeah.
Well, I have too. I've learned a great deal, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful talking to somebody who understands and admires Heidegger so much, and I suspect knows him a great deal better than I do, but also who doesn't, who appreciates him from a different perspective, as it were. I tend to, when I'm talking about Heidegger with others, it tends to be, broadly speaking, within the kind of theology guild. But I think it's great for those of us who admire him to, not uncritically, to understand, what sort of what power he brings to the particular disciplinary corners that we happen to be working with in philosophy. So thank you.
Thank you very much, James. Thank you.